Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better. Today's episode is about the album Repeater by Fugazi. This legendary post-punk band released their first full-length LP in 1990, and it still feels relevant today. We talk about the DIY ethic of the band and its label, and how they recorded a thematically unified collection of songs that is still interpreted in deeply personal ways by listeners who weren't alive when it came out.
You can find our show notes over at patreon.com/supercontext, and you can email us at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Did you love Repeater as much as we did? Enough to find an identity and a lifestyle in it? Charlie, on January 20th of 2025, which was, as we're recording this, I guess 2 weeks ago, I can't even remember. Everybody makes that joke about how time doesn't mean anything anymore, but literally, like, I just feel like I'm in a black void right now.
The joke that's been working on me is the whole, what a year. Oh, it's January, like the compression of action. But I'm with you. Time does mean something, but it also seems to not.
But there was an inauguration of a new administration.
Is this something you really feel like we should talk about? I'm not enjoying it at all.
I'm not going to say the human being's name.
Okay.
That's kind of where I'm at. And I don't know if I've told you this before, but my nickname for that human being is the Bad Penny. So that's how I'll refer to them.
Okay. Yeah, that is quite fitting now.
Bad Penny was inaugurated again, and I decided rather than doom scroll and watch the inauguration, I was going to listen to Fugazi's Repeater with my headphones on and make notes for this episode.
Sounds like a good plan.
Thanks. It felt like a win in a world that's been filled with a lot of losses lately. What'd you do?
I don't remember. Part of the joy of being a parent of multiple children is that if you're trying to distract yourself, you will be. And so, I've just been kind of careening around and trying to find the middle ground, I guess. I don't want to doom scroll. I don't want to ignore the news. I don't want to be angry all the time. I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to eat all of the pizza, but I would like to have some of the pizza. Like, I'm just trying to find a balance in most everything.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to just ignore trying to find a work-life balance or politics life balance when you're trying to manage a house with three, they're almost teenagers now.
Preteens.
Oh, I got one preteen and a couple of fast maturing grade schoolers. And Casey and I are learning that it's actually middle school that sucks. High schoolers, much easier to deal with, much cooler, much more fun to talk to. Middle schoolers suck. They are the worst. And I don't say that lightly because I work with grad students and faculty.
Wow. Yeah. And faculty, I don't know. But
I say this as a person with faculty status, so I'm just telling on myself when I say that shit.
It's interesting because I probably first heard this record when I was on that line between being a middle schooler and a high schooler.
Okay, we need to come back to that in just a moment. But the first thing I want to hear from you is, why did this record feel like a win listening to it on Inauguration Day?
Because the themes of this record lyrically are more relevant now than they were when it first came out. And I think its commentary on politics and social catastrophe and capitalism and greed are just incredibly of our time now. And I think this record is 30, if not 35 years old at this point.
It was April 1990, wasn't it?
Yeah, so 35.
I feel like I should make a joke about a 35-year-old and what kind of wisdom a 35-year-old can deliver. But also, it's kind of a bummer that the stuff they're talking about is still a problem. And it would seem that whatever we did in the 90s, it didn't quite make it, you know? We didn't quite find the change that we were hoping for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you're right. We are now in the position that our parents' generation were when we were teenagers and we turned around and were like, wow, that whole Woodstock thing, you guys really didn't carry that torch very long, did you?
Yeah, you can say, "Oh, the Summer of Love, great. That really didn't do much." And now, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah, Revolution Summer. Yeah, really solved a bunch of problems."
Yeah. Um, and not I think at the fault of the people who made this music or the people surrounding it. I think it's, generational. Geez, we are just going into a real doom spiral right at the top here. Um,
Shall
I
we
will,
extract ourselves?
yeah, I want to back up and say this, that this record was really important to me when I was your daughter's age because I was dissatisfied with the world that we lived in.
Yeah.
And I wasn't satisfied with the terms of success that my parents had set for me or my grandparents had set for them. And I was looking for people to be adult role models to me, people who I could identify with and who demonstrated values that I could make sense of. Because as I've talked about on this show before, I didn't get that at home.
Yeah.
And this record came like a bolt of lightning. It was, I didn't know you could adult this way. And I would say now, though, like having that 35-year gap as an advantage, I've come to believe that that's actually kind of what the punk and hardcore scene was for a lot of people. It was a form of primal scream group therapy for mostly lonely young men who didn't know how to communicate what was going on inside of them. And so people like Ian Mackay and Guy Picciotto seemed like they had figured it out. And maybe they had to an extent. And I think that that outlook is also ironic because that's not at all what this band wanted from their audience. There's even a lyric on this record in song number one that says, "Are you looking for an answer? You can find it anywhere."
Yeah.
Making fun of the fact that they were aware that people in their community were looking for the answers.
So I heard this record at a very different age. I was, what was I? I was 21, and I had grown up 15 minutes away from Discord House, never even knew about it. Never knew about Fugazi, never knew about anything really. I was a suburban kid. I was really deep in my own head, bookworm, whole thing. And I came to school here at Georgia Tech, and I was at a show, and the band, and I knew the guys in the band. A band played a cover of Waiting Room, and of course, anybody who's heard Waiting Room knows that if a bass player starts playing that, whether you know the song or not, your attention's caught. It is such a groovy, happy, bouncy, compelling bass line. So I immediately snapped to. I was like, oh, hey, this is a really good song they're playing. And then I don't remember the details, but I'm sure I said, that one song, that Waiting Room song was really good. And someone else said, oh, yeah, that's a Fugazi cover or something. And I heard someone from another band walk up to the guitarist or bass player of the band that had played Waiting Room and said, "Hey, you guys were really good. Listen, Fugazi's kind of sacred. Don't do that." And I have to admit, all of those things together, I was like, well, who's this band? Hook me up. And I, would eventually become deeply embarrassed that I grew up around them and knew nothing about them. But I listened to 13 songs a lot. And I listened to Repeater a little bit. But 13 songs was that was my Fugazi record. And for me, I think I was entranced by the music. I was entranced by really aggressive, cool rock and roll. Right? They think they're a rock and roll band. That's kind of where they stand. They've got a lot of influences far outside of hardcore. Uh, Rhythmically, sonically, lyrically, they stand out. But I didn't really connect to the ethics or the values that were presented in the songs. I especially had a hard time with it because uh, I had a really bad time with some vegan punks who were in my crew, or my crowd, I guess. Uh, and, sometimes I would get along with them and sometimes I wouldn't. And sometimes they'd be like, why don't you have any vegan food? And sometimes they'd be like, hey, let's listen to Fugazi. Anyway, so it was all wrapped up in
Sounds like they're social workers now.
probably, um, or since they went to tech, maybe they're engineers. Who knows? So my introduction to Fugazi was ahistorical. I thought the shit just dropped right out of the sky. And I have not really gotten close to Fugazi the way you were until fairly recently in my life.
Mm.
Always enjoyed the band, always enjoyed the albums, but I didn't do a dig in to try and find a way to live or a way to think about living.
Yeah.
And these
Yeah.
days, when I look at how they did stuff, I'm actually kind of embarrassed at how unfocused and unprecise and how kind of lackadaisical or chaotic I was as a creative person and as a member of society when I was their age.
Well, without judging you the way you're judging
Are
yourself,
you kidding? You judge me
I
all the time, dude. That's our relationship.
yes, but the show must go on. And I would say that what I heard there is that I came to this band through the ideas and the ethics, and you came to this band through the sound.
For
And
sure.
but I think we both now appreciate the whole package.
The whole package is pretty great. So let's do this.
Yeah, so the whole package we're referring to here is Fugazi's Repeater, which is the first full-length studio album. They're a band from Washington, D.C. In fact, I just found out yesterday that apparently there's a documentary being released that is called "We Are Fugazi from Washington, D.C."
Which undoubtedly has been said many, many times on stages where Ian MacKaye stood.
And this record was released April 18th, 1990. I've always thought of it as Repeater plus three
Yeah.
because the CD version came with the 7-inch EP, three songs appended to it. So I think of them as one long record, but technically, I think this album is just Repeater.
And some folks who are not familiar might be a little thrown by what? Repeater three, what are you talking about? Discord Records, which is the record label that Fugazi is on and many other DC hardcore bands, which is also run by a member of Fugazi. They were very interested in not being cheap with the people who bought records from them. So when CDs became a thing that they were releasing, they didn't release CDs with only an EP or only a single on them.
Yeah.
So the first record, Fugazi's 13 Songs, is actually not the first record. That is two EPs, Fugazi and Margin Walker, that on CD were released as 13 songs and kind of work as a whole record. And then there was three songs after Margin Walker, and then Repeater, And then the CD release was Repeater and three songs, which always messed me up because I thought Repeater was recorded and released before three songs. And so I kind of had this
Oh,
idea of it being, oh, we go from this record into this single, and that's the development, but it's the opposite.
I
I
think they
really,
were recorded at the same time, weren't they?
no,
Oh,
almost exactly the same time, but in terms of how they were recorded, there's a little bit of space, a little
oh,
bit of air. And I know
okay.
that because I've listened to some Ted Nicely interviews. We'll get to that. I now would have preferred three songs plus repeater just
Oh, I
because
see what you're
just
saying.
because I'm
Yeah.
kind of uh, I kind of overdo it in the whole. I'd like to listen to everything in the order that it was released, in the order that it was recorded, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Despite the fact that turnover is probably like one of the best ways to
It's so
open an
good.
album
It
of all
really
time.
is.
There is going to be on this episode a lot of us just just navel gazing about how much we love this album. I
Oh,
mean,
we're fanboys. I
yeah.
mean, I think some people probably know the story of I went to the Discord house and met Ian MacKaye and Joe Lally with my dad, who was a big hit with Ian MacKaye. That actually delights me more than almost anything else that's happened in the world. That Ian and Buck were fast friends.
And I know that you told that story on our Discord episode, which we
Oh, okay,
did
yeah.
probably, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago.
You've been
But
doing some re-listens, Chris?
I have, and we did a two-part episode about the history of Discord records,
Yeah.
but we decided to just focus on this record because it's so important to us. The story that I told during those episodes is the first time I saw Fugazi, which I discovered them when I was growing up in Singapore, and my American punk friends in Singapore introduced me to Fugazi. And similar to you, they played in a cover band and they played covers of Merchandise and Blueprint at our high school talent show. And I got to see Fugazi play in Singapore a month or two after Rollins' band played in Singapore and moshing was outlawed. And the Singaporean police were inside the show with assault rifles lined up against the walls.
Okay, well, that's not funny.
It was an extremely weird situation to see this band for the first time in. And what struck me then and still strikes me now is just, again, like I was looking for adult role models was the way Ian handled that was like, okay, this is super fucked up, but let's just try to have a good time and not get their ire up.
Yeah.
So you actually like because of the Fugazi live show archive, you can download a recording of him talking about this now on their website. Um, he basically says, "Hey, like instead of slam dancing, why don't you try pogoing?" He's like trying desperately to plead with the audience, "Don't get shot during our show."
Oh man. Okay, and before we launch into this, let me just remind myself we're going to talk about the record and our enjoyment of it and like what's on it a little bit because you can't escape that. But mostly we're going to talk about how it was made, how it was received, how people understand themselves in relation to the record, how it was regulated, and what kind of identities are represented in the work.
Yep.
Circuit of
That's
culture, baby.
that's the Super Context Project back after 4 years. Now, where was this record recorded and who recorded it?
It was recorded in Arlington, Virginia, my almost hometown. This is in the summer of '89, as we mentioned before. This is between was it a world tour? No, it was between two big tours. They came home for the summer and recorded at Inner Ear Studios, which is the legendary studio run by Don, is it Zientara?
I believe it's Zientara. That's how
Yeah.
I've always said it. Yeah.
Produced by Ted Nicely and probably also produced by Don and engineered by Ted too. Like, just kind of as a team. Inner
Yeah.
Ear, I urge you to look up Inner Ear Studios and see all the people who recorded there. It's kind of amazing.
and it's gone now.
Yeah,
It's sad, but I
everything goes,
believe that those
Chris.
archives are being held on to. I've seen several of the artists talk about how they went down there to get their master tapes. Um,
Now, if you are not familiar with the DC area, Arlington is a neighborhood that is part of DC, a large one. But a thing to think about is that Arlington is on the other side of the river from the rest of DC, but it's still part of that diamond that you think of when you picture DC, on the Potomac.
mhm.
So it's both of and not of the sort of political DC.
Okay. Um, so one of the things that you dug up that I thought was pretty interesting about this album was how it was recorded, because Ted Nicely was apparently in culinary school at the time, and so the only times he could record were between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like everybody who talks about Repeater in like a, you know, let's look back at this amazing record and talk about the recording. So Ted Nicely could only record in the mornings because he was going to be a chef. So Ted Nicely was a musician and a producer and just an all around, present guy in the music scene in DC. But as he says, you know, reflectively, I thought I was doing a good job as a producer, but I didn't think it was going to be what I did. So he was going to culinary school to be a chef.
Hmm.
And he he also pushed back. There's an interview from a podcast called End on End, which is a project of listening to all of the releases of Discord records from end of 2021. And nicely says, I think that Repeater took about 23 days to record and mix. And the thing that I said, I think we can get this done in 3 weeks, maybe a little longer. And then he gets a little defensive. I mean, it wasn't because of my schedule, because I was there every day. So people talk about, oh, he was in culinary school and he couldn't be there for 12 hours a day. Well, Fugazi didn't want to be there for 12 hours a day either. They were doing hard 5 hour chunks of work with Ted, and everybody was pretty happy about it. Um, I had 2 days off a week. This is Ted Nicely. And the rest of the time, we had a good 5 hour session before I went into my work. And the studio was close to where he worked. And he said, and I could just be late. I could shave it a little bit. And Fugazi wanted him to produce it. They asked for him, asked for him by name. And he said, that's the way it had to be. Because at that point, I didn't really believe in this producer stuff. I mean, I knew I was producing the records and I think I was doing a good job of it. But as far as like I was going to still be doing it, in 10 years or something, I didn't believe that. I had never even crossed my mind.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially from our perspective now, as like middle-aged men who've had dreams and also like tried to plan day jobs around them, and to hear people who you think of as sort of legendary, they had to do the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, part of Fugazi realizing that they were a successful band or it was a successful project was when they could quit their day jobs.
Yeah. I think we don't have this in our notes because we are just so accustomed to this, but I think it is worthwhile to assume that there might be somebody listening to the show who does not know who the members of Fugazi are, and we're about to dive
Perfect.
deep into their contributions to the songwriting. So, uh, Ian Mackay, vocals, guitar, other stuff. Guy Picciotto, I'm probably not saying that right.
So I've always heard Pichotto.
Guitar and vocals on this record. We'll talk about it in a minute, but prior to this, he was just vocals. Um, Joe Lally, bass. He doesn't sing on this album. He does in later albums. And then Brendan Canty on drums. Those are the instruments they play on the record. That doesn't necessarily mean those are the instruments that they wrote the music on. For instance,
That's right.
Brendan wrote guitar riffs for some of these songs.
And I think I always just knew in my head, oh yeah, Ted Nicely and Zientara, those names, I see them on the liner notes. I never really thought about what that production must have been. And the kind of kind of legend of Fugazi sort of implies that they were they knew exactly what they wanted to do, exactly how, and they didn't need anybody to help them. They were just going to
Yeah.
go in and record their perfect songs, you know.
Hmm.
And of course, that's not it at all. Listening to Ted Nicely and reading a lot from Ian and Guy about how the recording went and how the recording of their next record, Steady Diet of Nothing, went, it seems like Fugazi was such a democratic band. You know, Ian MacKaye so forcefully said, I'm not the leader of this band. This is not Ian's new band. We are a band and we all share equally. They kind of didn't have a tiebreaker. They didn't have anyone in the band who could say, okay, look, this is how we're going to do it. So their producers often were the person who corralled an argument and was able to say, we're going to do it like this. And they liked how Ted did that.
Mm.
Uh, he says the thing about doing Fugazi records is that the things that get mentioned as far as performance and everything are more in the vocal area. I don't think I asked Brendan to change anything.
Yeah.
So
Well.
they played live so much. They had their songs rehearsed. They were, you know, they're legendarily hard rehearsers, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So they knew the songs. But then they get in there and their producers and engineers are miking them, figuring out how to get the sounds, and also trying to get them to find the place where the vocals live in their
Hmm.
big guitar sound.
And I think too, this may or may not be in the notes, I can't recall, but something to remember here as well. One of the many things that made them such a unique band is because of that relentless practicing and touring so frequently, they had like an unspoken like onstage telepathy with one another about what direction they were going in for what song was going to come next or
Yeah, I do have some
um
quotes about that in the notes
yeah,
in a little while. Yeah.
and infamously never had set lists. Like
Hmm.
they would go out there, they'd start on one song, and then it would either be maybe a gesture to one another or a look to one person or the next, and that unspoken thing allowed them to know, okay, we're gonna do this next one.
And it's good you're talking about live performance now because the thing about Repeater that they were trying to do was they wanted their record to sound like them live. And there's a little bit of finally in that, you know, because there were some points of dissatisfaction with all of their releases up until that point. And I don't in any way want to be like, Fugazi didn't like their records until Repeater. That's not what I'm saying. But uh, there was some talk about, hey, did we get everything right on the first EP? The sessions for Margin Walker were supposed to be an LP, but they didn't like some of the performances because, as I read, they started recording at Southern Studios in England the day after the last show of their European tour that year.
Hmm.
And they were like, we didn't really think it through. And so we were exhausted.
I've actually read something similar in an interview with Brendan about the album after this, Steady Diet of Nothing. He at one point said that he was really unsatisfied with that recording, and if it was possible, he wishes they could go back into the studio and re-record the whole album.
And that was their first attempt at producing a record themselves. And that's that sort of no after you, oh no after you thing. Really, that's what they feel like kind of undid the sound of the record, even though the songs were not bad.
Yeah, but I don't think any of us listening would have ever picked up on that because these albums just hit you right in the gut,
They do.
and uh, they are now the holiest of holies in the genres that they came out of.
Okay, easy there, Tiger.
So let's talk about what these songs are actually about, why people do apply those kinds of terms to them. We found quite a bit of research on this, which is good because I'm not going to dive into it, but I sat down and I did a close reading, which is a
Yeah.
rare thing for super context of the lyrics to every song and just like I haven't done this since I was in high school, probably just sitting there with the lyrics.
Yeah, that's a close reading you've been preparing for your whole life.
Yeah, many of the lyrics on this album have such a abstract poetic quality to them that it is, I think, purposefully not easy to pin down what the
Yeah.
subject matter is.
Despite the reputation that Fugazi and in particular Ian Mackay have for being stridently ethical
Yeah.
and presenting a worldview, this is the right way to live. People compare Fugazi lyrics to other hardcore band lyrics. And I say other hardcore bands. Everyone calls Fugazi post hardcore. I have always said post punk just because you got to say something. But
hmm
post hardcore, I think that's the Wikipedia genre that it's landed in. Yeah,
you know how I feel about genre.
I sure do.
I feel like it's mostly bullshit and is really only useful for either marketing or academics. But uh, I think both are maybe applicable here.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think
all
you could also say they're a reggae band in some sense. I mean, like there's
reggae influenced. Yeah.
sure, yeah,
So it's a band made up of people who've been playing in the DC punk scene for years. But instead of being a fast, in your face, strident, this is how you ought to live hardcore band, they were a kind of groovy, heavily dynamic, impressionistic, personal band with
yeah.
lyrics that operate kind of like poetry in some ways and have images that are concrete but don't have concrete meanings.
Yeah, and so let's start with the title song, Repeater. There's a great piece just about this song by Ryan Little in the Washington City paper. I think it's like a retrospective that they do, like about local bands' music, a certain number of years after it's been published. He interviewed Ian, and Ian said during the late 80s in Washington, D.C., crack came into the city and then guns, and there was a serious bloodletting, a big spike in gun homicides. There was such repetition in the papers, they started to take count. I believe what he means is how many people had been killed this way. He says people would become numbers, and it was a repeating situation. With every death, there are people who had lives. There are people around them being forever changed, and the tendency we have as a culture to stand back and blur our eyes. I saw that being exercised in a really intense way in our city. These explanations are unreal compared to what you would get from any other contemporary, mildly successful band in 1990.
Say more about that.
I can't imagine any of the popular music of that time someone sitting down and saying, "Hey, I really wanted to talk about how the human condition is deplorable because we look at mass murder through mass media as just being, some kind of blurry, vague number counting."
Yeah. I forget where I read it. I mean, there's obviously we read so many articles and interviews to get into this subject. But someone described Ian as a person who was trying to remove all the extraneous and useless things from his life. And uh, in some way, that is removing the kind of the assumptions that one would have about being a major label artist or
hmm
the assumptions one might have about I'm trying to live separate from my community because I've got my own stuff going on. Fugazi was a local band, like big capital letters, local.
hmm
And there's a lot of total idolization of Fugazi. There's a lot of holding them up as these perfect specimens. And obviously that's a little too much.
hmm
But there's a special thing about Fugazi. This band was a set of four great players, charismatic musicians who cared about each other, cared about themselves, cared about their home, in this case, Arlington, Virginia, cared about their community, and it just everything just worked. I think a lot of that was they didn't chase ideas that were about denial of reality or the kind of solipsistic existence that some artists can fall into.
No, I think they were very grounded in reality and what was going on around them. And we talk about this in that Discord episode that, or the double episode that we did. A lot of that came from their participation in what was referred to as Revolution Summer, which was a big political protest movement that was engaged with Discord Records in the years prior to Fugazi becoming a band. Um, so I don't even know if you've seen this or not, Charlie. I have in my office at work a framed newspaper on my wall. It is a project that somebody did maybe 6 or 7 years ago, where they did data collection about Fugazi, and
Oh,
then
I've
they
seen this
created
online.
like
Yeah.
charts and
Yeah,
things like
yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah.
And the one I have up on my wall is a spread that is a chart that shows all of the various causes that they raised money
Yep.
for and how much money they raised for each cause, with these like colored circles representing the amount of money. And I love it because it's both like a beautiful piece of graphic design, but it's also just a perfect encapsulation of their activism.
Yeah. Uh, we got far away from the song Repeater. I think it's a perfect place to go back in talking about activism. They were uh, they were taking some inspiration from hip hop at the time. They were paying
Yeah.
attention to Public Enemy and the way that other rap artists were thinking about and engaging with crime and
Hmm.
their local community, local scene. So yeah, Pachotto says Rebel Without a Pause would be specifically one song that we all looked to. That's Public Enemy. The main ascending whistly sample on that one was so nuts. It's hard to remember now how hardcore that song sounded when it came out, but it was really shocking and so badass.
It's funny because I don't want to tell this whole story right now. Maybe we'll do a Public Enemy episode one day. But when I used to teach public speaking, I would use Public Enemy as an example
Yeah.
of media literacy with my students. And that was 15 years ago, and they had no idea who Public Enemy were, and they were blown away by it. Even now, I would imagine they're even more of a foreign commodity to today's youth.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a little vertigo inducing to think of,
Yeah, but they were
people
so
not knowing.
influential, and rightly so. And it's interesting, like I would have never, when I first heard Repeater, thought, "Oh, Public Enemy," but I can absolutely see the through lines now.
Yeah. And Chad Clark says that Pachotto actually found a way to try and match that sound playing on his guitar, picking a particular spot on the guitar to play to get kind of a shrapnel sound, a
Yeah.
high pitched, a squeal. But he also then refers to him as, of course, it's not all dissonance, Clark writes. There's this really simple, clean arpeggio that's so simple at the heart of the chorus. It's so light. It's like a Smith's song. Anytime someone tries to take apart a Fugazi song, they can usually find some random ass influence or reference or homage from something you wouldn't expect.
I do think we should provide some context about Chad Clark. Chad Clark remastered this record in 2005. He is
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I jumped right over that. Yeah.
I don't know what the term he's an engineer, I guess, is the right way to say it. And he is also a big part of the Discord record scene. He played in the bands Smart Went Crazy, and he's currently in Beauty Pill, which are both Discord bands.
And so Chad listened to this record very carefully. The musical style of the song was inspired by Public Enemy and the Bomb Squad, he said. All those squalling bursts of guitar are kind of impressionistic versions of samples. Ian MacKaye says, I was trying to write a DC anthem. They were trying to connect in the way that other acts outside of like the hardcore scene were trying to connect.
Yeah. This quote by Clark really resonated with me when I read it. It's not something that I had thought before, but I think he's bang on here. He says, all Fugazi songs to some extent sound like alarms. They have a charge, which is why they're famous and why we love them. But here, it's got this instant reset button effect on the show. I just remember it as a blast of cold water and frantic energy. So I want to speak to that a little bit because I think you would remember this even better than I would because you're a little older than I am. But there was this idea in the 90s that some bands were noise bands and they were using traditional instruments like guitars with effects pedals to create these just like unheard of noises before, right? And, you know, our parents would say literally, like, I don't understand why you're listening to that. It's just a wall of
Yeah,
noise.
turn off that noise. Yep.
But it it's interesting because the band that is still, I think, to this day most celebrated for that is Sonic Youth, and I think of Fugazi's guitar sound on this album as being the pinnacle of that and being like it is what I thought Sonic Youth was going to sound like the first time I heard them.
That's so funny. I mean, I never enjoyed Sonic Youth. And I heard Ted Nicely talking about Sonic Youth, and he said, yeah, he didn't really get them either. But then he saw them live and he said, they were amazing. And I went to the record store the next day. I was like, we got to listen to this new record. And he said, when he heard that record, he was like, whoever mixed this, if I were Sonic Youth and I sounded the way I sounded live and I heard the mix on this record, I would go and murder the guy
That's
because
interesting.
he
Huh.
said they just didn't translate to
Yeah.
record.
Yeah. I think something that's probably worth pointing out here too is that, and this is something that we saw in the research specifically about this song. We're still on just one song right now.
We're about to
Um,
take a big jump though.
so Repeater was a song that when they played live, sometimes it really worked and sometimes it didn't because of those alarm skronks, weird whistly
Hmm.
guitar sounds. Um, and the way I read it described, I think it was Brendan, was that it depended on the room that they were in and the way that those sounds would echo off of the walls or the density of the audience, that kind of a thing. So it's really interesting. I don't know how many of those archived shows you've listened to, but sometimes when you hear this song live, or if you watch like a YouTube video of them playing it live, it's a little surprising because like it's just this hurricane of guitar noise on the recording. And then you kind of hear the live version, and you're like, whoa, this they're technically playing the same thing, but it's not filling the room the same way.
Yeah. And that goes back to a thing that Nicely said about the production. He said for this record, he mic'd everything up and he wanted it to be really powerful and airy.
Hmm.
He wanted something heavy with density, but he wanted there to be a lot of air. And I think that might be dancing about architecture there, but I also think that he's talking about something in the ear that there's room for things like that feedback, that noise, the
Yeah.
squonks, the screams, and that it didn't overpower the song that was being played. It didn't undo the really tight rhythm, but it was a heavy song, but it had room for more.
Mm-hmm. I think we can wrap up our conversation about just the song Repeater with this quote from Mackay. He says, "For me to really lean into my music, I have to feel it. I have to believe it. It's just my nature to think about my world, the city I'm living in, and write about it." This, I think, is testament to, again, like something that was wholly unique about this band. I believe on the documentary Instrument, Guy says something to this effect in another interview where he's like, it. He basically says like, being in this band is a lifestyle choice for me.
Yeah. Now, it's good to mention Ian as a songwriter because Repeater was kind of a turning point, the song and the record. Um, Up until this recording session, most of the songs were Ian's songs that he had written because the band formed over a period of years.
Hmm.
You know, Joe and Ian played with another drummer for a while. Then they got Brendan, and then because Brendan had been in a band with Guy came to check things out, and he sort of hung around until he was part of the band, like on stage, but not really part. All that to say, Repeater was the first time that they recorded songs that they had all written together, jamming in rehearsal, and finding music to match lyrics that were written in particular by one of them, right? Ian or Guy.
Yeah, and it's the first record that has two guitars too. Yeah, they wouldn't have been able to accomplish that whirlwind of noise that we were just referring to with just Ian playing guitar. Um, but this is worth pointing out that, and this is a quote from one of the pieces that Angus Beattie wrote for Quietus. He describes Guy as being the Flavor Flav of Fugazi up until this point.
And on purpose, like
Yeah.
he took that role and said, I'll be the hype man. I will say, yeah, at certain times and
Hmm.
re-sing lines and do call and response like Flavor Flav.
And again, like, you and I have talked about this off recording, but also like if you can see this if you go on YouTube and watch videos of them playing live, whenever they played those older songs, Guy put the guitar down and did his Flavor Flav thing.
Yeah.
There was never a point where he was like, "Oh, I'm gonna add a second guitar to this song." No, that was how it was written, and he was gonna dance around and Flavor Flav is a good analogy, but I always think of that guy Bez from the Happy Mondays. He's like another one of those guys who's just always up there, just like slapping tambourines together and saying
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I bet you none of those other guys stuck their bodies through a basketball hoop, though, to sing a song.
I don't know that any of them could have physically done so.
Yeah.
Yeah, either with upper body strength or weight.
Let me just say to listeners, if you don't know what I'm talking about, when you have time, please search on YouTube Fugazi basketball hoop, and you'll probably see what we're talking about pretty quickly.
So the thing that is interesting though about Guy picking up a guitar is that he was worried that he was going to duplicate what Mackay was playing. And they pretty quickly found out, no, that's not going to be a problem here, especially because of this sort of jamming style of writing songs. He used his guitar the same way he would use his voice. He offered it up as a different tone and pitch to complement rather than consolidate what was already there. And again, this comes from Angus Beattie and Quietus. It just added a whole nother level to this band. So I have to confess again, like you're a couple years older than me, so it makes sense that 13 songs is what you heard first. This is what I heard first. And uh, just the guitar on this record is just amazing.
And it sounds like not one big guitar, like it's only one guitar playing, but it all sounds at once, I guess is the way to say it. It's not like interlocking guitar parts like television, say, or like
Hmm.
two guitars in the classic sense, like AC/DC. It's this wall of sound, except when
Hmm.
it's not. Okay, if we're talking about Fugazi, we're going to have to quote "Our band could be your life," right? Michael Azerrad's "Our band could be your life" is a seminal text in '90s alternative music. He writes, upon returning from the European tour, this would have been after the attempt to record Margin Walker. the band, all agreed that Picciotto should start playing guitar. The problem was Mackay's sturdy rhythmic style meshed seamlessly with Lolly's supple dub-influenced bass. Can I just pause here for a second?
Supple bass. Mm.
Reading Azerrad now
Yeah.
as a middle-aged man, I had a moment like, oh God, how many times did I try and come up with an adjective for sound that was bullshit
Yeah.
and material? Okay, anyway. Picciotto couldn't find a way in. Then he realized that there was a wide patch of sonic real estate in the upper frequencies. Using a Rickenbacker, the trebly, chiming guitar made famous by the Byrds, that feels like a dig, Picciotto would cut through Mackay's chunky chording like a laser beam.
Do you know what kind of guitar I played when I was in bands?
I can only assume a Rickenbacker because of the way you're saying it.
I wish it was a Rickenbacker. I couldn't afford a Rickenbacker.
Yeah,
So I had a Rickenbacker clone that
nice.
was made by Jay Tercer Guitars. But I was very much influenced by the sound that Guy had on this record. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to talk it through. Um, you mentioned that you were hoping to find some gear stuff, and the internet obliged. Do you want to talk about guitars for a minute, Chris?
Yeah, I think I'll sort of talk about it broadly and then you can get into the nerdy ephemera here. I don't know that we need to read this all out, but
No, no,
the
no.
reason why I wanted to talk about gear is again, like there are hallmarks about this band that were different from many of the other bands around them. And one of them was that they were very light on effects and they were Ian. I actually thought both of them did this, but according to your notes here, it's just Ian. Ian solely plugged directly in to a Marshall head with a Marshall cab and turned up the gain. That was it.
He had a DiMaggio super distortion pickup.
Those are built into the guitar.
Yeah, yeah. So there was something that let him have a kind of raucous sound, but yeah, he didn't have a pedal or anything. Guy only had three pedals that I guess probably made sense to him. And they had the same guitars. Guy had two Rickenbackers and Ian had two Gibson SGs. They didn't want to carry around a lot of gear.
But yeah, I mean, there wasn't, they weren't fancy. You know, they just used the tools that were available to them. I mean, you go see a band nowadays, and look, I love bands that do this, but like 9 times out of 10, they have an effects pedal board with like 10
Hmm.
pedals built into it, you know, to get just the exact right sound out of their amp. And that I think this band still did that, but they did it with minimal fuss.
And they probably established this early on when they were a band playing around town, you know. They carried their stuff. They wanted to have a setup that could get in the van and go on tour pretty early on.
Was that a oblique Henry Rollins reference that you just threw out there?
I mean, if we're talking Fugazi, there's no obliqueness to the Henry Rollins references. Ian and Henry, Ian and Hank, they talk on the phone every Sunday.
Is that right?
I have
They
that's
have
just
Sunday dinner together?
no, it's just you see that in the articles. You know,
Oh,
Henry
okay.
Rollins and Ian Mackay were old buddies, and Ian is mentioned in Henry Rollins' pet store story
Yeah.
he tells,
Yeah. I
and they still
love
talk.
those Henry and Glenn comics. I think I've showed them to you before, but somebody should probably do like a Henry and Ian comic as well. It would be pretty amusing.
Yeah. So to finish with the gear, they didn't look for um, a lot of processing or extras or, you know, trying to change their sound by putting it through a pedal or anything like that. They changed their sound by changing what they were trying to make happen, right? By trying to figure out how to play the next song. And that's another thing that's like just the so gives such a heartfelt kind of, oh, these guys were so great because they really cut through a lot of what I think of as the 90s slacker artist bullshit. You
Yeah,
know,
I think
let me
you're
get some
right.
really cool tools and I'll do stuff on the weekend and I have a day job, but also I'm really trying to make some things happen. They were almost like workmen, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Well, they were because they weren't taking money from other people to put out their music, they had to be. They had to tour relentlessly and they had to practice 5 hours a day to be as good as they were.
Yeah. Here's that quote that I was talking about earlier. Okay. This is from a Pitchfork interview in 2001, like right before the hiatus. Pachotto says, I think it took us 2 years to get kind of familiar with each other in terms of the four of us playing together and figuring out what we were trying to do. The cool thing about the band was that Joe and Ian had developed a kind of relationship, and Brendan and I had developed a bit of a relationship because we'd played together for 5 years before Fugazi. So the four of us coming together was like feeling each other out. And I think it took us a couple of years of really constant touring to figure out how to play together.
Yeah.
And Repeater, the record, is the end result of that. The interviewer said, I'd say you guys are one of the tightest bands around that I can think of. And Guy said, we're not actually. And Pitchfork says, seriously, it comes across that way. And Guy says, we fake it. This is bullshit, but we fake it. I mean, we know each other really well. We're actually incredibly sloppy, but the thing is, we've honed ESP. We know where we're all going with each other, and I think that's what makes it really unified. And that's also why the band can't function without all four of us. It's not like a cog you can replace, it's much more than that. So
Yeah.
Guy basically said, no, we're not tight. We're just tight.
No, but I understand what he's saying. I mean, this is referring to what I was talking about earlier in that they didn't have a set list. They had this understanding between the four of them of what direction they were going to go into next because
Yeah.
they'd played so frequently together.
And they rehearsed so much. So if you started playing a lick, the rest of the band knew what was happening right away.
But I probably saw them 6 or 7 times, and every time was different. Every
Yeah.
time was amazing, but every time was totally different. And you could tell there were occasionally moments where they were just kind of kind of
Finding their way
jamming
to it.
at the end of a
Yeah.
song, trying to figure out what the next song was going to be, you know? I mean, that was still awesome to me. The thing is like they didn't it wasn't like they were constantly stopping and there was like 30 or 40 seconds between a song and everybody tuned and then they would get, I mean, they
Yeah.
did that. I'm not like mythologizing them, but there was just a breakneck speed to it because they just played like it was one long song.
Yeah. Okay. So we dug in on Repeater, the song, talked very specifically about the lyrics and its meaning. Let's open up a little bit and talk about the rest of the record because someone called it a concept record. And I don't think it is a concept record in sort of like the, Genesis way, but it has a kind of unified feel and that comes across especially with people retrospectively digging into those lyrics. We have got some more from Angus Beattie. Into this unprecedented and absorbing sound, Fugazi poured lyrics of depth and weight. All that sound and fury was never going to be allowed to signify nothing. Ooh, wordplay. There is, of course, an enigmatic quality to some of the writing, allowing the listener to make their own interpretations and for the music to come to mean something individual and personal, even amid the hooks and choruses designed specifically for communal involvement and shared release. Some of the songs are obvious, others remain occluded, and each individual listener may end up putting different songs into each category. I do like that. That there is something about the Fugazi songs that allow you to latch onto them very deeply if you're going to latch onto them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do want to speak to this for a second. So this Angus Beattie piece that we keep reading from was one of the only pieces that I could find that wrote about the themes of this record in a way that felt mature and observational and not like that they were just regurgitating factoids from,
Right.
the myth of Fugazi. So that's one of the reasons why we keep turning back to this. But so to your point, one of the pieces that I had read, I remember the reviewer saying something to the effect of like, "Yeah, every song on this record is great except Greed. That song really they didn't need to include that. That was just kind of a waste of everybody's time." And it was like, what apparently, like you say, Charlie, like people latch onto certain songs and they don't latch onto other ones. But I was listening to it on my way home from work today, and Greed came on, and I thought, how could this record exist without that song? It's absurd.
So the concept that is posited is that it's about money and activism and living your values in a way that does not make you bought and sold. That's, I mean, that's rough. That's not, that
Yeah,
doesn't like encompass everything, but that's kind of where most of it lands.
I think so. And I would say too, to the poetic quality of the lyric writing, that it's not supposed to have like a one-to-one translation either.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think these are songs about subjects like political violence and, uh, you know, uh, capitalism, but not calling it out. Nobody on this is using Mark Fisher's lines about late stage capitalism on here, but that's what they're basically talking about the same thing, you
You
know?
know, none of the Fugazi members ever seemed resentful about earning a living.
Sure, yeah, but they were also conscious of the economy that they existed within.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's songs on here about drug addiction. They're about the realities of what these guys were seeing in their day-to-day lives.
And they're very particular about saying that they weren't trying to write songs to get a message across, or they weren't trying to write songs and say, here, you have to know about this. You have to live like this. It was like that Ian MacKaye quote. It was important to them to write songs that mattered to them, about things
Hmm.
that mattered to them. That's how they wrote songs. Because if you're a band that plays, you have to have songs to play.
Well, yes and no. I mean, something that is notable about this record is there's at least one instrumental song on it. Are there two? I can't remember. There
Well,
might
it's
be an
be,
instrumental song on three songs.
yeah, that's right. So there's
Okay,
Brendan number one and Joe number one.
that's right.
But Joe
Okay.
number one's from the three songs EP or single. I don't know what you want to call
So
it.
they don't have to have lyrics, right? Like that was another thing that to me as a 14-year-old listening to this record for the first time, I was like, wait a minute, you can do that? You can just stop singing?
That's hilarious. For me, this is like, this is not even a question, you know? Like, fucking, of course, sometimes you have a song that has no lyrics and it doesn't actually change the larger, project. That's very funny. You and
Yeah.
I had such different musical paths.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, you have to remember too, like I came up on the musical path that they came up on,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So like within the 80s punk community, nobody was just jamming, man. Like that wasn't a thing. I mean, maybe there were, but it was pretty uncommon.
Yeah, it doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like you don't have a hardcore band get up there and then say, let's do 10 minutes of a riff and see what we can find.
Right, right.
But that's how they wrote some of their stuff, right? They played together for 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, and some of that's going to be messing around and riffing around. And I think they found a lot of stuff that way musically that they wanted to explore.
So one more quote from this Angus Beattie thing that I want to end on here. He says, perhaps what comes through loudest and strongest from Repeater is the way that this record addresses how the personal becomes political, which is in itself almost in a way a description of what Fugazi, as a band, ultimately have come to represent. There's a little bit more, and then he comes down to it and he says, there's lessons here we can all learn from if we're willing to listen with an open mind. Now, that's a very interesting way to close out talking about this band. And I think, again, there is a context that's missing here, which is that at the time that Fugazi were playing and this album came out, there were a lot of assumptions about them both within and without the punk community, about who they were and what their values were and um, what they were trying to persuade other people to do.
Yeah, their attitude towards their audience and other
Hmm.
people.
Uh, so
You've heard
yeah, I
that
mean, I
one.
think it's interesting. I think it's notable because these lyrics are so poetic and metaphorical. Other people applied their own meaning to them
And made up stories about them. You know,
because,
you've heard that
yeah,
one about they all lived together in a house with no heat, right?
yeah. I mean, they joke about that in one of the documentaries. Yeah, I think that's because like the alternative at the time was either, grunge or it was uh, straight up hardcore bands, no post about it. And it was one singer up there preaching, it was Choke from Slapshot who was telling you about the glory of being straight edge and loving hockey, like there was no metaphor to be had there.
Yeah. If they were somehow transposed to the 60s, they would have been folk singers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I, I'm not. I don't know that I'm going to ride along on that metaphor with you,
Aw,
but
come
like,
on, that would be fun.
but I do think that the you and I were joking about this earlier that like their influences were not punk influences,
Oh,
they
yeah,
were
yeah.
influenced by classic rock and
That's not what
60s
I'm going
folk.
for
Yeah.
exactly, though. What I'm really thinking is they they were present in the moment, the artistic moment that they were in, and they used what they had at the time to talk about what was important to them. And that would have been, that's Bob Dylan. And I'm not saying so they're Bob Dylan, but I'm just saying that
Yeah.
they weren't like trying to write hardcore songs or write not hardcore songs. They were writing songs based on what was important to them, what they saw with the music that was important to them. And if they heard something that sounded lame or cliche, one of those 5 hour sessions was them breaking apart the riff and figuring out how to make it sound interesting.
So are you saying then in the upcoming Oscar bait biopic that Timothy Chalamet is going to play Guy?
Holy shit. That doesn't sound terrible.
Let's take a break and we can ponder that some more and then we'll come back.
Hey, Chris. Things are a little different these days. I don't quite know what to say in this break. I guess there's just the Patreon, right?
Yeah, there's no advertisers and no point holding space for advertisers. And so, in honor of Fugazi, why don't we just do this for ourselves?
Love it. And we're back.
There is something that I feel like has just sort of been hanging in the air on this episode that, again, like it's probably a blind spot for both of us, which is we haven't really explained what Discord is because we spent like 4 hours talking about it on a previous
Yeah.
double header episode.
And there is a trap that we're falling into on this podcast when this is just something that's been part of our lives forever. You
Yeah.
know, like obviously not forever because we just explained when we first heard them, but it's just in there. And it feels kind of like, well, everybody knows about this, even though that's not true at all.
Hmm.
So we can certainly recommend the 4 hours of Discord talk from earlier in the run of this podcast, or you can do a quick summary, Chris.
Yeah, I think the like 30-second version is that Discord Records is a Washington, D.C. independent record label. It's co-owned by Ian Mackay and Jeff Nelson. They founded it in 1980. It's known for the same things Fugazi's known for, having a do-it-yourself ethic, producing albums at reasonable prices, without,
Handshake contracts.
yeah. And primarily, they see their mission as documenting the Washington, D.C. scene. When you say scene, it sounds like it means every band in Washington, D.C. I think it's their community of
Yeah.
punk, hardcore, post-punk, whatever the hell you want to call it.
They have a great website with a lot of information and a lot of fun things on it. Discord is DISCHORD. Discord, so discord.com.
Yeah, nowadays people will get it mixed up with
Yeah, right.
the
Yeah.
social media app.
And it's a cool spot. I got to go, I got to see it. The Discord house, which is where half the band lived in a house with no air conditioning, is across from the building where Discord Records is situated. And it's full on DIY. It just feels very much like a mom and pop kind of business,
Yeah.
or what the venture capitalist folks call lifestyle businesses. But what it meant was that Fugazi Fugazi's record label was pretty much themselves.
Yeah, right. That I think that's fair to say. And that like this was there is a distinction when you play music over being in a band and being in a band that is a business. And I think these four people navigated that in a unique way, probably better than most, because
Eh,
the money was coming through them.
yeah, and it is well documented. Uh, I think Atlantic Records offered them however much money they wanted to sign.
Yeah.
Just, however much you want, and you can do whatever you want. Just please sign with us. And they never did. They never signed with a label other than themselves.
Um, that brings us to talking about how this record performed. You know, that's something that we usually talk about on these super context episodes. In this case, we have the numbers. So the record came out in April of 1990. They spent almost all of 1990 and 91 touring.
I mean, they spent most of their time touring. If you look at the historical schedules on the Fugazi site, it's like, yeah, that's what they did.
And when we say touring, you know, again, like if you're unfamiliar with this band, you're thinking, were they playing stadiums? No, but they were regularly selling out rooms of over 1,000 people, which is, you know, pretty impressive when they're playing in places like Singapore. Um, this record sold 500,000 copies originally, but it has since gone on to sell more than 2 million worldwide.
That's pretty good, isn't it?
I mean, I think it's enough for them to feed themselves with, which is the goal.
It sold really well. And also, whenever someone talks about it, well, let me just go through these lists. Uh, it's been on the 300 best albums of the past 30 years list and the 90 greatest albums of the 90s list from Spin. Alternative Press had it as one of the 90 greatest albums of the 90s. A lot of people did that, I think. Pitchfork says top 100 albums of the 90s. It's one of them. Best 150 albums of the 90s. Lost at Sea. I don't know that one, but 90 albums of the 90s. Uh, Best indie rock albums of the 90s. Best hard rock album of each year since 1970. 100 greatest albums of all time. 100 greatest rock albums. 50 most influential albums of all time. 300 best albums from 1984 to 2014. Top 200 tracks of the 90s. This is mentioned by Pitchfork, Complex, Loudwire, Consequence of Sound, Kerrang. It just it is a respected and celebrated record.
There is something I want to point out about this accolades list, though, that's interesting. The earliest date that these accolades are awarded is 1998. So eight
Yeah.
years after this record came out. And I want to point out something that is interestingly ties into a Super Context listener. So, Super Context listener Kevin recently met with me and gave me a copy of a book that is like a compilation of all the Spin magazine
Oh, okay.
reviews of like the important alternative albums of the time. And this book was published in 96. So I think it collects reviews of all these, you know, heralded records over the last 10 years maybe. I don't remember when Spin started. Fugazi is nowhere to be found in this book. They have no listing. And there are listings for incredibly obscure acts in there. I mean,
Now,
like,
I have a theory about that.
Yeah.
Discord knew that it couldn't afford to keep sending out review copies and sample copies. It couldn't flood the market. In the air about Discord is that they did not really send records out to be reviewed, you know, like on regular lists, or they didn't
Yeah.
have publicists who were flooding all of the media offices with the record. Uh, they kept costs down. They wanted to sell records to people who wanted them. So if you didn't know about Fugazi and you were writing reviews for a magazine, you weren't going
Hmm.
to stumble on them in the pile of stuff that gets sent to your office.
So you're saying, okay, you're saying like the writer's room at Spin, they may have known about Fugazi, but they weren't writing about it because they didn't have a free copy right in front of their face.
I feel like that's a big part of it. Because
Okay.
also, you're going to get a ton of records. I mean, I think you and I have both been on the end of publicists'
For
emails
sure.
and mailing lists and package lists.
Yeah.
You get fucking flooded.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to figure out what you're going to write about, you got a lot of things to get to before you get to, what dude really likes, because he grew up around DC before he moved to New York.
But 9 years after this album came out, somebody at Spin was like, wait a minute, this is actually the 36th best album of the last decade.
Well, by the time they got to the late 90s, what was it? In on the Kill Taker, Red Medicine, and Hits had all come out,
Hmm.
and the stories had gotten bigger, and more people were talking about the blank check that they didn't pick up and all that.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, and those are the supposedly true stories. That, like I said, there's also just this like absolute whirlwind of bullshit rumors and conspiracy theories about them because they weren't behaving like every other band did.
And that meaning they weren't doing the stuff that most bands seem to do to get noticed.
Yeah, yeah. So speaking of that, something again that we cover on every episode of Super Context is representation. And I think that it's worth noting this. I know that there will be some listeners who write in cranky emails that we shouldn't have to say this, but despite how radically progressive this band was for its time, it's worth noting that it's still a band composed of four white men. And I think that's not a judgment. I'm not judging them and saying, nope, they should have made sure that they had a United Benetton uh, picture for their band lineup. What I'm saying is, this is a reflection of the state of the punk scene at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That there was very little room made for people of color, or for women, or for non-gender conforming people, even in these very progressive uh, corners of the genre.
Despite them being very much influenced by Bad Brains and
Yeah.
Public Enemy. Yeah.
Yeah, and something that was this is again another like Fugazi legend. Um, there were complaints about earlier songs like Suggestion or later songs like Reclamation that were about women's rights, and the complaints were Ian MacKaye shouldn't be able to sing songs like this.
Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
I I know that there are formal theories as to why it's inappropriate for someone in one identity slot
Hmm.
to try and ventriloquize, speak for someone who's in another identity slot. But I don't know what that clear statement is. I understand that you shouldn't pretend to be speaking for or pretend to channel some lived experience or cultural identity or history that you don't know about.
Hmm.
But there's also a narrative art tradition to essentially attempt reportage, and
Yeah.
to write characters realistically who are not like you. And somewhere as I was growing up and as I started to care less about what my favorite artists were doing, people started being very clear, like, you don't get to write about these problems. These problems need to be written by the people who have them.
I don't have a clear answer for you, but I think in the way that you phrased the question, you sort of answered it yourself. Like there is a divide within, for lack of a better term, like progressivism about storytelling, whether it's through
Yeah.
lyrics or fiction, on whose story is whose and who gets to tell it. A text that I often turn to about this is a book called Writing the Other by Cynthia Ward and Nishi Shah.
Ah,
I've probably brought
yes.
it up on the show
Yes, you
before.
have. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Clearly, I didn't read it at the time, though. I'm sorry.
their argument is that the you can't talk about women's issues if you're a man is a cheap cop out. Because really, what would be ideal is for you to do the work and to think it through and write about it realistically and from an
Yeah.
authentic point of view, uh, and learn something from it, right? Like to me, that's the important thing is like you're considering somebody else's perspective and developing either empathy or sympathy for them.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're thinking right now, oh man, you're so stupid, I am happy to get an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com with some references or just a statement or even just a little bit of a scolding. Go for it. I'm totally cool with that. Uh, I might not answer a scolding, but I will accept it.
You fuck off. You've been answering Jeff Vandermeer's scolding for the last 8 years.
Oh, who the fuck just brought up Vandermeer? Oh my God. Okay.
So, all right, I want to wrap that up so that I can just say, like, Ian did push back on this idea that he wasn't allowed to write those songs. And I don't know where he stands on this issue today. But at the time, what they would do is if they were playing locally, they would ask Amy Pickering, who was in a Discord band called Fire Party, to sing Suggestion with them live. And that's another thing. Like you can go back and listen on these archived recordings of their live shows. You can hear a very different version of that song.
Yeah. And Azerrad, who we talked about, wrote Our Band Could Be Your Life. He said, Mackay thought the criticism was nonsense. The lyrics are about rape and sexual molestation of women. Quote, it's a human issue that we should and will continue to have to deal with. He remonstrated. Remonstration is how people think Ian Mackay always talks.
Yeah, I think Michael Azerrad definitely chose his words carefully there to try to paint a picture.
So we
What
talk,
do you think that guy's doing now?
he's probably cashing some checks.
We should look that up before we continue on. He's probably dead.
No, he's not dead. He's happy to have another release of Our
Steve
Band Could Be Your
Albini's
Life.
dead. Why can't Michael Azerrad be dead? He's 63 years old.
Dude, how many fucking people are you going to
Let's
bring up in this show?
let's see how many. All right. He is, as far as I can tell from a brief skimming of his Wikipedia entry, done nothing since that book.
Yeah,
Okay.
cashing some checks.
Okay.
I mean, the book still sells. You know it does. Okay. When we're talking about representation, as we do, we went looking for stuff, and there's not a lot of, not a lot of uh, criticism that starts from the point, "Hey, these were four white guys." You know, like
Mhm.
it's just not a lot to sink into. So I found something that we can talk about a little bit. This is a
Ugh,
Reddit
this is
post.
going to be tough for me.
Please don't shoot me. This is a Reddit post from December 2024. The
So,
title
so
of it,
for context, that's 5 weeks ago
yeah,
from our current point in time.
it's entitled "Is Fugazi Problematic in Any Way Possible?"
And I'm going to assume that this is r/punk.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And I love this, right? This is the post. I'm new to Fugazi and I listened to their 13 songs album and I really like it! Exclamation point. I want to get into more, but I just want to know, are they problematic in any way? If they are, then damn, comma, I just want to know, please and thank you. I mean, this is terrific, right? And it does say a lot about how we assess things now.
Not we, the generations younger than us.
Well, I think it's not just the young people. All right, here's a selection of replies. Fugazi and its members have long been celebrated both as a band and individuals for being politically progressive, anti mass consumerism, and anti corporation. They don't sell merch for cash grabs and have always kept shows as affordable as possible for fans. In short, nobody's perfect, but these guys are pretty damn close.
Okay, I'm going to read the next one. Not that I'm aware of. In fact, I'd say they are more morally uptight than almost any other artist I can think of.
We're learning a lot about people in this one. The next one. They, and specifically Ian, are the epitome of punk guys. I have never heard anything remotely problematic about them. I've met Ian a couple times, and he's such a nice dude.
All right, I'm going to do a different voice for this next one. Ian MacKaye is basically a punk saint. If there is any controversy about the guy, it's probably from the wrong people. He was probably pulling for you before you were even born.
Okay, I hope the person who posted that does not listen to Super Context. Another person mentioned there was some controversy over Ian singing Suggestion from a woman's perspective, but it really was quelled by having Amy Pickering sing it live in the early days. I mean, okay, that's folklore essentially. And then there's the last one.
I think some folks give Ian shit for one of his previous bands, Minor Threat, for having the song, quote, guilty of being white. But that's as close as it comes to being problematic, I think.
There was a reply to that. Yup, has been canceled for that already, thankfully.
So
And that was the only comment that was downvoted.
so I hate this, but also I do want to provide some context for what I think is going on
I
here.
love that you hate it.
Um, I don't know how familiar you are with the band Anti-Flag.
Oh, I'm kind of familiar.
So Anti-Flag were a band similar to Fugazi in a lot of ways, in terms of ethical stances, politics, DIY, putting out their own records, booking their own tours, all that stuff. And recently, like when I say recently, I think it was in the last 2 years, it was revealed that their front person, Justin Sane, had sexually assaulted or been accused of sexually assaulting and molesting several women. And I think that that threw a lot of people off because, similar to Fugazi, they sort of looked up to him as this like role model. And then he was revealed to be the opposite of that, you know? And so I think there are a lot of young punks who don't have access to a community in real life and are looking for guidance from the internet.
Yeah. And Fugazi's persona presented by them or inflicted upon them, I think would give a lot of people a certain cynical satisfaction if you
Yeah.
found out that they were shitty.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that that was something that many people were looking for a very long time was any sign that it's like when I go to a bar and I don't drink and people that I'm with get fussy about it, about me not having alcohol, you know?
Yeah,
What's
because
the
what's your
what's
fucking problem, Chris?
right? That what's the quote? Like I can't trust a man that doesn't drink alcohol or something like that. You know, like everyone was always looking for there to be another shoe that dropped with Fugazi.
Right. And so far, there hasn't been one. All right. Regulation. Regulation as a concept does not get a lot of play in the stuff we talk about because there's just not often censorship or, things aren't seized by the government and all that. But when we were doing this research, I realized, oh, it would be totally appropriate to talk about corporate regulation, right?
Hmm.
Sort of capitalist regulation. So, in an article called Punk Lives, Washington's Fugazi claims it's just a band, so why do so many kids think it's God from 1993?
That is from a legitimate
That's a
newspaper. That's
Washington
not a
Post.
punk
Yeah.
zine.
Yeah. Newspapers were wild back when they were still relevant.
Yeah, before they were owned by Jeff Bezos.
One thing earlier Fugazi releases, that is to say, Repeater, didn't have, but you'll find on In on the Kill Taker, which is the 1993 album, are UPC barcode stickers. So Discord didn't put the bars, the barcode on the records.
Yeah.
Those barcodes, and this is back to the article, they enable the sound scan system, which Billboard magazine uses to compile its hit charts to document commercial sales. Fugazi now permits barcodes, so this is 1993. Fugazi now permits barcodes on the outside of its packaging, but refuses to incorporate them into the album cover's artwork, as do most record companies. That is to say, they don't print into the artwork the barcode. There's a sticker that goes on the plastic that
Yeah.
is wrapped around it. It's a compromise that enables the band to get into the large chain record stores, which do not accept merchandise without the familiar vertical lines. So at the time that Repeater came out, they couldn't or wouldn't sell it in big retailers. And I don't think that means like it wouldn't sell in Tower Records. I mean, it probably didn't sell in, God, what was going on at the time? It didn't sell in Target or, you know, fuck. You know what I just realized?
Strawberries.
I didn't look up what stores are the Target, Walmart, and
Oh, of
et
the
cetera
time.
of the time because I just didn't even think about that until
S-
this moment.
Strawberries is the one that comes to mind. That was the big record chain that I believe was you had to have a barcode to be
Yeah.
distributed within.
So I think like Best Buy and Media Play, they sold records along with their
Mm,
electronics. So stores like that, I guess Walmart was around. Stores
it
like that
was.
didn't have those records because they uh, didn't have what they required, quote marks, required to sell.
But I also want to challenge this a little bit because this didn't mean that it was difficult to get these records, right? First of all, you could very easily send a self-addressed stamped envelope with cash or a money order in it to them, as they described on the back of every record, with whatever, $8,
Yeah,
$10.
this record is $7.99
Yeah.
post paid from Discord Records.
And they would mail it to you. The second thing is, remember, I lived in Southeast Asia when I first got into this band, and I was buying their cassettes in record stores in Singaporean markets. So yeah, somehow they were distributed all the way over there. It's not like they were only sold out of the back of Ian's van.
Yeah. I think Joe Lally said that there's probably more purchased but unlistened to copies of In on the Kill Taker than any other Fugazi record because that's when it landed in stores where people could stumble upon it and it was getting some like press because also it was in bigger stores and that kind of cycle of reinforcement. And he thinks that people bought that record just because it was the new thing that was out, and maybe some folks didn't listen to it.
You know who bought a copy of In on the Kill Taker?
Everyone I knew in college.
My mother.
Oh, as a gift for you?
No, my mother wanted to try to relate to me, so she started buying albums that she knew that I liked, and In on the Kill Taker was one of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you have a favorite song?
I don't think she listened to it.
Well, there you go.
Maybe she did, but
Joe
I don't.
Lally was right.
Yeah. So, speaking of teenagers who were obsessed with this band and had strange mothers trying to understand them, let's end this episode by talking about the themes around this record, and not just maybe the lyrical themes, but just, the ways in which people made meaning
Yeah.
around it and, like myself, like created an identity.
I would go so far as to say secured an identity.
Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
You're right, I didn't create it.
Okay. So we talked about the song's meaning or the purpose of the songs to be anti-capitalist, anti-corporate, anti-merchandise, you know. Um, but like within the record, the themes and the things that people could engage with were things like greed and violence, sexuality, privacy. That's a big one. Drug abuse. The last song of the record is, I think, counts as a harrowing description of the aftermath of an overdose. Death,
Yeah.
real stuff. This record is not filled with songs about a boy or a girl that someone liked, or a fun road trip, or a story about a made up character who is interesting.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
record is about the things that were happening to them and around them at the time.
Not just that, but also dark aspects of our society that polite company doesn't normally like to talk about.
And it was picked up by celebrities who were signed to major labels, who did have some kind of persona created that was out there, who were doing the things that we keep saying Fugazi wasn't doing. I forgot about this until I read it. Eddie Vedder had Fugazi written on his arms when he was interviewed by MTV in 1991.
Hmm.
And Kurt Cobain of Nirvana wrote Fugazi purposely misspelled. That's what it says here. He wrote Fugazi on his shoes during a photo shoot.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but I remember the Headbangers Ball thing. Um, I think that was right around the time that I was falling out of interest with grunge and fully dedicating myself to the cult of punk and hardcore. But yeah,
How fucking dare you?
yeah, I'm sorry. They were probably playing Even Flow or something, and uh, yeah, what was up with the just writing things with Sharpie on things?
Okay, I'm just going to move on from that moment and say we talked a lot throughout this episode about an identity that one might pull from being a Fugazi listener or being a Fugazi endorser because they seemed so solid, so complete. They did
Hmm.
not do stuff like go on MTV with another band written on their arms or figure out a
Hmm.
way to get their fandom shown in a photo shoot for Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
They did not peacock or do tell-alls or date people that got them in the tabloids or anything like that. They were pretty straightforward, good boys. And that became, like you were talking about the drinking, that became, they were ascetic monks who hated everything except veganism and playing music.
You keep coming back to the veganism thing, and I want to pause on this for a second because my memory of this was that they were not a band that was associated with veganism until after they stopped playing.
Let's go
Yes,
to the book, Chris.
yes, the members of the band were vegan, but I don't remember it ever coming up in their music, their lyrics, or on stage where somebody in the band would say, like, you shouldn't eat cheese or something like that.
I think it was actually vegetarianism. And let's see. Both Mackay and Picciotto are extremely uncomfortable with connecting the band's business style with something as personal as vegetarianism, but the same sensibility as at work in is at work in both cases.
Who is this from? Sorry, what is this from?
Michael Azerrad.
Oh boy.
Here's the thing. They didn't do it. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. That's the reason I
I
keep
see
coming
what you're
back to it
saying.
is
Yeah.
they didn't do it, but it was done for them and to them.
Okay.
That principles they seem to live by or had mentioned briefly in interviews were taken and turned into like the straight edge stuff. They were
Yeah.
turned into rules to live by that were a way to do in group, out group dynamics.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that one was a hang up from the hardcore scene, and two, from Ian's association with it, right? Like Minor Threat is considered a foundational band within that scene. And as we read earlier, often Minor Threat's lyrics were very didactic.
Yeah.
This is how I live my life, so should you.
And Ian MacKaye was the producer on a lot of records and co-owner of a label that put out a lot of records. So he was understood as a leader in the scene. Like he had to
Hmm.
say to himself and to others, I don't want Fugazi to be Ian's new band. I want it to
Hmm.
be a new band. So he was put in a position of leadership, put in a position of guruhood, and his personality kind of fed into that. Very direct, very no bullshit, very stubborn but thoughtfully stubborn. Like I'll just keep saying the same thing until you understand. If you just think about it, you'll understand what I'm trying to say.
I think too, a lot of that came from the conversations in between songs during their live shows. They
Well,
were
the dancing
notorious.
thing and
Yeah.
the moshing thing, like
Yeah.
they were known to tell people to stop slam dancing,
Hmm.
to not perpetrate violence in the audience because we're all in it together. So don't do that. You'll hurt someone. We've had enough of that.
Yeah. Speaking of which, here's a little personal aside. One of the times that I saw them, the two bands that opened for them were Karate and Unwound. And I was in the front row during Unwound set, and somebody stage dived and kicked me in the face so hard that one of my contact lenses popped out of my head.
Oh man.
So I had monovision for the rest of the show.
If I remember karate correctly, they are not stage diving music.
It was during Unwound, but
Sorry,
I
sorry.
would say none of those bands are stage diving
I
music,
mean,
but
Unwound at
karate
least gets a little
very,
cranked up. Yeah.
yeah, karate is very much not like that. Yeah. And I don't remember the audience particularly enjoying them.
So this is the knot to untie with Fugazi. It's very easy because of the way that they do things to take on an identity from them because it seems like they're very not rigid, but like they're very solid in their rules of life. And that's partly because they had some simple principles that they put into place, like DIY and minimizing costs, uh, not being entertainers, being a band that was going to play, and you're an audience that is here with us, and we're all having an experience together. That sort of democratic artist thing that Ian and the rest of them pushed so much. You know, uh, if you were without a lot of structure to your ethical self, or if you were looking for a way to feel solid against other groups out there, I think it was very tempting to buy into the image of them that you created. And that image probably wasn't correct because they weren't doing photo shoots and Rolling Stone interviews and having features written about them in, and trying to scandal or date or spectacle themselves into MTV News. And this is where I tell on myself. I was kind of nervous about doing this recording with you because Fugazi makes me think about the things that I wish I had done better.
Hmm.
And I used to maybe have a like, oh my God, those guys are so, you know, they're so unproblematic or whatever. But really, the more research I did here, the more I recognized, oh, the thing that my identity resonates with in an unpleasant way is that I recognize in them an insistence on process, immediacy, short term goals,
Hmm.
as opposed to imagined end results like we want to be famous. How do we be famous? Or we want to be a band that everybody loves. How do we be a band that everybody loves? And I always got caught up in, especially with novel writing, thinking about how it would be when this is finally done and it's big and famous, as opposed to just doing the work that appealed to me.
I said it before on the show. I think in a lot of ways you're a romantic, and that's where that comes from. That like you romanticized ideas of novelists or records or and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I don't think that that's a negative quality. I think it shows like a level of imagination that you had, you still have, but you were like you had a need that you wanted fulfilled. It wasn't getting scratched. And so you were creating those narratives, I think, to do that, maybe without psychoanalyzing you too much. I would say, though, from the other side of it, well, first of all, I have talked to listeners of this show before who do not have the same musical interests that I do in real life. And they have almost in an embarrassed way referred to my musical background as being like a cult. And I think in a lot of ways that's fair, especially like, I want to return to what I started this episode with. Like, I do think that punk and hardcore in a lot of ways was group therapy for kids who, again, like they weren't having their needs met at home and they didn't know how to communicate that. And what in different ways, bands like this or bands like Slapshot or Earth Crisis or whatever, right? Different people picked little things out of them and made their identities out of them. I think reflecting back on it as an adult, yes, like I took pieces of this record and of this band's ethos, like jigsaw puzzle pieces,
hmm
and kind of plugged them into my own puzzle to make sense out of the world for myself. But I think that there's plenty of problems that go along with that too. Like even though these things were quote unquote ethical or moral, right? Like stances about capitalism or whether or not you eat meat or whether or not you drink or how you look upon violence and sexuality and drug addiction in our society, politics, all these big things, right? Um, but there were still I still had plenty of problems that were unaddressed, right? That like it took decades for me to recognize and unpack and um, become who I actually am, like figure out who I actually am without needing an artifact like a book or a record to help me do that.
That might be the fantasy of Fugazi for me and other folks, not everybody. The way they presented themselves made it seem like they were who they were from early on, and that was never threatened by what they decided to do.
You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
All show notes are available at patreon.com/supercontext.
And you can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com.
I'm available on Blue Sky as @ChristianSager.
And I am not available. I have a scorched earth policy on social media.
2 N's, 2 T's.